When I was about 4 years old, my house caught on fire. My bedroom was on the second floor, and the fire was on my side of the house, so my room filled up with smoke. I remember vividly someone waking me up that night. I thought it was my mom. At the time, a sweet woman's voice told me to go to sleep in my sister's room. Bear in mind, I was never allowed in her room, as I was the annoying little sister. My mom woke up that night to the smell of smoke and went to find us. She said that my room was so filled she couldn't even see her own hands, and in a panic, she went to wake up my sister to help find me. She found me asleep on my sister's bedroom floor. If I had not been woken up by whoever or whatever it was, I would have definitely suffocated and been roasted alive. I had burn marks on my floorboards until the 8th grade when we moved out. This story happened about 4 months ago, and I swear I'm still completely freaked out. I don't expect you to believe my story because I can't even believe what I saw for myself. Sometimes, I secretly still hope that what I saw was just a loose branch or some shadow, but I highly doubt it. I'm a 14-year-old male, and every year I go skiing with my family somewhere in the mountains. Usually we stay for about a week with our camper on a campsite. The campsite is only a few minutes away from the gondola that we used to ride up to the top of the mountain. I know the area very well. We have been skiing there since 2013, so for about 5 years now, and I have never experienced anything like this. Every year there's a big party with concerts on a mountain at the top of the gondolas. The party falls on the week when we always visit. This is very important for the story. The party is always in the evening, and on this day, you can go skiing until midnight. Usually the slopes close at 7 o'clock in the evening. My brother, sister, and I always love this night because skiing in complete darkness is totally epic. So, like every year, we grabbed our skis and snowboards and headed up to the gondola station at around 9 o'clock, 2 hours before the concert started, so that we still had time to go night skiing. I had a snowboard accident only a few days before, so I couldn't snowboard for long periods of time without my knees hurting like crazy. So, my parents, siblings, and I headed up to the station with the gondola. It was already dark outside, but still light enough to see something. I remember rubbing my knee and hoping that I could enjoy the night without too much pain. But by the station, many people were already gathered, around 200 to 300 people, and some bands were already playing on the big stage. My siblings and I started to head down the slope. I was on my snowboard, and my brother and sister on their skis. My parents were listening to the bands while drinking some beer. They didn't plan to go skiing that night. We were skiing for about 1.5 hours, and more people gathered by the stage. My siblings and I took the lift up one last time to be there for the beginning of the concerts. About half an hour after the beginning of the concert, I noticed that my knee was hurting a lot. I was tired and stuff, and I was also freezing. My parents offered to take me to the gondola and go to the campsite to get a good night's rest. I agreed. My parents and siblings stayed up on the mountain because the concert was still a few hours long, and it had just started. So I grabbed my board and stepped onto the gondola that would take me back to the valley. The trip down to the valley with the gondola took about 20 minutes. There were not many people in the gondolas around me because most people were still up there enjoying the concerts. I got out my phone and started playing some random stupid game. After about 15 minutes on the gondola, I heard a low thud from the gondola behind me. I looked up from my phone and was completely confused because I was sure that nobody had gotten on the gondola behind me. I turned around and squinted into the darkness. I could see the gondolas behind me, but not very clearly. I had no idea where the thud had come from or what it was until I looked at the bottom of the gondola. There was a creature hanging on the bottom of it. I could only see the outline of it, so I wasn't sure if it was an animal or a person or something else. I stood on the top of the bench in the small gondola and opened the small window on the side of the doors to get a better look. I turned on my phone flashlight, and what I saw then almost made me drop my phone out of the gondola. At first glance, I thought it was a coyote, but on second glance, I noticed that it definitely was no coyote. The creature was about as big as a Dane and was covered in black-gray fur with patches of fur missing. Its face was completely weird. The snout was way too long for a normal coyote, and the teeth were sticking out both upper and lower jaws. The eyes were yellow-reddish. The creature was holding onto the gondola with its long, skinny arms. It had long, menacing claws. I stumbled back and pressed myself against a glass window, looking down, hoping that I would be in the valley soon. But I had about 5 minutes left. I could already see the station. I kept my eyes glued to the creature behind me on the other gondola. It stared right back at me and grinned. Not a kind of dog grin that you know if it's panting or sometimes looks like they're smiling, but no. It was a full-on grin, wide mouth, and showing its teeth. Then it started to rock back and forth, still holding onto the gondola. The entire thing started to rock, and so did mine and the ones in front of mine and behind me, all because this thing was swinging. They were attached to one long steel rope. I started to get scared. I tried to calm my breathing down, to get rid of my anxiety attack. The creature flung itself forward over to my gondola. It tried to grab the bottom of my gondola. I was completely shocked when it jumped because the gondolas are about 20 feet apart from each other. I heard a large clang as the creature held onto the bottom of my gondola. The valley was only a few minutes away, and I completely freaked out and started crying. I heard a loud pitched scream from under my gondola, and I huddled in a ball on the bench. About a minute away from the valley, I heard the creature let go and drop to the ground, which was about 50 feet away, with a loud thump. I peered down and saw it sprinting away into the woods below. After I got off the gondola, I could barely walk or speak, and after I made it to the camper, I locked all the doors and windows, curled up in a ball, and cried. I didn't go skiing the next day, and didn't tell anyone what I saw because I knew they wouldn't believe me. My name is Emily. When I was around 12 or so, I remember spending the night at my friend's house. For privacy concerns, we'll call her Rose. Rose and I did everything every preteen girl does. Go to the park, eat junk food, paint our nails, etc. Sometime before we went to sleep, Rose's neighbor came over. We'll call this girl Jay. After some talking with the parents, they decided to allow Jay and her brother to sleep over too. We all went to bed and obviously, we were all on our phones instead of sleeping. It was around midnight when Jay and Rose just happened to mention that the night might get a little interesting. Jay went into this story about how ever since she was small, a shadow had been following her. She described it as really short and extremely skinny. She then added that its eyes went all the way through its head. I called bullshit and proceeded to joke about it. I began to tease the shadow by saying, "Oh, it's a joke. What are you gonna do if you come? Come and get me." That was probably the worst mistake I've ever made. Almost immediately after I stopped teasing, the room grew colder. We all got back under the covers into our phones. Suddenly the cold was unbearable. We all began to shiver and held on to each other for warmth. We had all linked hands and held as a sense of danger washed over us. I gasped as I felt a cold, bony finger poke my leg. I immediately thought my friends were playing a bad joke on me. I asked Rose and Jay if they had poked me, and they said no. They couldn't have anyways. I began to get scared. I was starting to believe in this shadow creature my friend talked about. It was around 1 o'clock in the morning at this point. I was exhausted, as I had to wake up early the next morning for a family event. After a while, I managed to fall asleep, only to be woken 20 minutes later. Rose felt a hand press into her thigh, the same cold, bony fingers that had touched me. I was a full believer in the shadow creature. The cold room, the ghostly hand. It was all too real. I squeezed my eyes closed, hoping I would fall asleep and this would all be over in the morning, or, better yet, I dreamt it all. But no. Rose had an old television on a TV tray in her room. Her room was pretty small, so the TV tray was near her bed. An hour later, at 2 o'clock in the morning, the TV tray broke, meaning that the huge old television fell onto the bed, pulling off the blankets and dragging Jay down with it. We all screamed in fear and woke everyone in the house. Jay's brother and Rose's dad came into the room to see Jay on the floor and a pair of scared kids on the bed. We explained what had happened, but Rose's dad told us to knock it off and to go to sleep. Jay's brother stayed with us for a couple of minutes to investigate why the TV tray had broken. He concluded that someone had kicked it, but nobody could have kicked it. We were all in bed, and the door was closed. We all went to sleep at 3 a.m. in the morning. It was all over, almost as if nothing had happened the night before. The shadow continued to follow me home that day, though. Sometimes I see it in my doorway, peeking in, or at the foot of my bed. It makes me feel safe. So my grandparents put their old 150-year-old house for sale. They were not home at the time, and they left me alone to deal with the real estate agent coming over with the potential buyer later that day. So the real estate agent arrives and brings with her the potential buyer, a very nice Muslim lady and her 2 little girls. But I noticed that one of the little girls was of Indian descent rather than Arabic ethnicity. Funny enough, she was wearing a Catholic school uniform. It almost looked identical to the uniform I had to wear when I went to pre-primary. It's a bit weird, but whatever. So, I let them into my house, and the 2 girls walk upstairs. The Indian girl looks at me as she walks up with her hand on the banister and gives me a smile. I went downstairs to open up my uncle's granary flat, and after waiting for them to look around my grandparents' house, I walked down to the granary flat, and their little girls run past me. They ran into my little cousin's room, and I went in to make sure they weren't messing around with any of my uncle's figurines. The Indian girl was sitting on the bed, stroking my cat, while the other girl was asking me a really dumb question about some dead hamsters. I decided to stand outside with the keys to lock up once they were done. And after about 10 minutes with the mom and the real estate agent, we walk out with the little Arabic girl, and I'm standing there, pausing, watching for the little Indian girl to come out so I can set the alarm. The real estate agent looks at me and says, "Why are you waiting? Why don't you just lock the house?" And I reply with, "What? I'm waiting for the other little girl." Obviously, the real estate agent gives me a really funny look. "What other little girl?" I give them a look. "The one with the Catholic uniform." The potential buyer then looks at me in shock. I only brought 1 daughter. And at the same time, the real estate agent gestures to the 3 of us, me, the mom, and the girl. Shit. I went in and scoured the place. There was nothing, and there's nowhere she could have gone or hidden. It turns out that there was no other little girl in a Catholic uniform. Not a living one anyway. My brother is the janitor of this church, and he works late at night. Before he started working there, not only did he not believe in ghosts, but he actually thought that those people who did were of inferior intelligence. This first experience he had was when he was trying to study in this one room at the front of the church. He was trying to study, but this noise started, and it sounded like whispers in a language that he couldn't understand. He thought his brain was just playing tricks on him, so he kept trying to study. But the noise got progressively louder and louder until he just couldn't take it anymore. He ran out of the church. The scariest experience he had was one night when he was vacuuming. He had a phone at the time that would annoyingly inform him every 5 minutes for the hour before it died due to low battery. So, he was vacuuming like he always did, and then he received a call. It was from the church's phone number, which was weird, and before he could pick up or reject it, his phone instantly died. He started sprinting to his car, and he heard the noise of the door in front of him opening, even though it stayed shut. He told me that he smoked 14 cigarettes in his car on his 10-minute drive back to his place. After having these experiences, he started asking other people who worked at the church if they had had any of these things happen to them. All of them said yes. The scariest one was this lady who works in one of the offices at the church. One night she was working late, and the church was empty when this old woman called Mabel entered the church. So she looked up and was like, "Oh, hey Mabel, are you coming to the service tomorrow?" Mabel ignored her though, and continued towards the stairs, and then started walking up them. This left her very confused, and felt that maybe Mabel was being rude or perhaps she just didn't hear her. So she left the office to go upstairs and find Mabel, but there was no one there. She then remembered that this particular old woman had had her funeral in the church recently after dying the week before. Crazy shit. I work as a paramedic in Louisiana. Needless to say, after being in this profession for a while, you'll see your fair share of creepy things. However, nothing I've experienced can top this. The unit that I work on is quite rural compared to most others in our fleet. It was a busy night, so we were posted at a halfway point between our station and another in town, to cover both parts of the area. We liked to park off the road about a quarter of a mile into the woods, so we would not be bothered while we were there. It was late, so my partner and I got down to the back of our unit because there is much more room to stretch out and relax in the back. My partner was asleep, and I was messing around on my phone. I felt something bump into the side of our unit, shaking the whole truck. Now our trucks are heavy, and it would take a substantial amount of force to shake it like I had felt. I woke my partner and told him, but he brushed it off, thinking I may have been dreaming or something. Then it happened again. He immediately shot up and looked out the window, and I did the same. We couldn't see a thing outside, and it was too dark. We made the decision to turn on the unit floodlights, which illuminate the entire area around the truck. I moved from the window to hit the button, and my partner stayed behind, looking out the window. As soon as I turned them on, my partner gasped and jumped back from the window. I could see it as well. The light from the back of that unit illuminated an approximately 7-foot-tall creature. It looked like it was turned around, but I could not make out a face. Most of it was hairless, but I did see some matted patches of hair here and there on its body. It had extremely long, skinny arms that appeared to drag the ground behind it. The parts of the body that were hairless appeared to be gray and wrinkly. It wasn't moving, just standing there with its back towards us. We decided to radio dispatch and told them to get a police unit to our location, as it was a large animal outside of our unit. About 5 minutes later, we saw the lights from the police unit coming from down the road. The creature looked in the direction of the lights, turned its body, and very calmly walked into the woods. The officer walked up to our unit and opened the door. We explained to him what was going on. He said that he didn't see anything as he was pulling up, and whatever it was gone. Now it's been a few months since seeing this creature, and I've never seen or heard anything like it, and I have not seen it since. Granted, we don't park in that area anymore. Needless to say, we have stayed in the front of the truck now when posting, ready to floor it and drive away if anything like this happens again. So, I work in a factory making rope. A bit odd, I know, but bear with me. I've worked here for about 4 years now, and I've had some strange encounters, which I might one day get around to typing. But for now, I'll just tell you the one that frightened me and amazed me the most. Now, quick backstory. Because of the age of the building, people tell me that a lot of people must have died in here. This was way before the days of health and safety. We have open machinery running all day. But actually, there have only been 2 deaths of which I know. One guy went head first over a rope wheeler. His hand got snagged on a bit of rope sticking out, and it pulled him in. He hit his head on the floor when he went over and broke his neck. The other guy hung himself in the stairwell to the loft. So, recently, I was working on the same wheeler that this guy died on, which isn't weird. We use it every day almost, and it was over 30 years since he died. I was on my own, listening to my music with my headphones on when I saw my colleague, Clive. He walked through the door and came to stand next to me, watching what I was doing. Because of the danger of this machine, we tend not to interrupt each other while we're working on it. So I carried on working. Suddenly, something snagged on the back of my hand, and I felt the pressure of the rope pushing down on my fingers in a vice-like grip. So, this next bit happens in a few seconds, but it felt like forever. Anyway, I tried to pull my hand away, but it was too late. I felt my body get pulled towards the machine, and then I felt something hard smack me in the chest, and the pressure lifted from my fingers. I was free, standing upright, and the machine was still going. So I hit the big red stop button and looked at the machine. Then I turned and looked at Clive. He was white. I know from experience that Clive does not believe in anything paranormal, but he just stood there in silence. "What the?" I said, looking like something just hit you in the chest. He sort of trailed off. We talked about it sometimes. What happened, why, and if it was the guy who died previously on that machine. I don't know the guy's name who died, but if it was him, I'd like to thank him. I tend to say hello now when I'm in their area, just in case he's there, so he knows he's not forgotten. Thank you, ghost guy. I figured I'd share some stories with you, strangers, about what I believe to be a paranormal experience happening in my place of employment. I will not say which restaurant or city for obvious reasons. The restaurant has been around for about 30 years, so you can already imagine how old the building is. I work as the bread baker during the night hours. My shift is usually from 8:30 to about 3 a.m., depending on the products needed to be made. My coworkers tend to leave at 10 o'clock. Sometimes the dishwasher is there a little bit later, though. I got lucky moving here and landing this job right away at $13 an hour. But now, I don't feel so lucky. My first experience was the second month of working here. I had just put some hamburger buns in the proofer and had some time to kill, so I walked into the dining area to make myself an espresso. Halfway there, I noticed a faint whistling coming from the dining area. I shrugged it off, and it stopped once I entered. As soon as the espresso was done, the whistling started again, but louder. I couldn't make out if it was a song or not, but it went on for about a minute, and then stopped. My whole body shivered as I was definitely creeped out. So the next day I mentioned this to the dishwasher, and she looked at me for about a minute and then just sighed. She told me that the building is most definitely haunted, and that she constantly hears the whistling as well, but only when she is by herself. The conversation ended there as she doesn't speak English very well. Fast forward a few weeks later, and this experience freaked me out pretty badly for a few days. I got chills thinking about it, and you may not think it's creepy, but it was. Anyway, we have this huge walk-in cooler filled with tons of prepared food and so on. This was around 11 p.m., and the dishwasher was still there. So, I walked into the cooler to grab some butter. The door is huge and heavy, so there is no way that wind can shut the door, especially because there was no wind to shut it. As I was reaching for the butter, I hear the door slam behind me. I was obviously startled and thought maybe the dishwasher closed it, thinking that I left it open by accident. I walked to the door and started yelling for her, hoping that she would hear me. After about 3 minutes of no response, I panicked. It was super cold in there. I kept banging on the door and yelling, and after about 10 minutes later, she finally heard me and opened it, looking confused, visibly shaken, and shivering. I asked her if she closed the door on me, and she said no. So I told her the door had closed on me, and the look on her face freaked me out. I texted my boss and told him what happened, and asked him to please check the security cameras. When he answered, he told me he'd watched, and said that he saw me walk in, and about 10 seconds later, the door slammed shut. No one was behind it. It just shut by itself. That's never happened to anyone else, and we were both very confused, and I was weary. A few more weeks pass, and in the dining room, they mopped the floors every night and put the chairs on top of the tables. I noticed that they were in their usual spots on the tables, and didn't think much of it. As I was making bread around midnight, something happened that I cannot explain. In a span of almost 5 to 10 seconds, I heard the loudest crash coming from the dining area that shook the whole building. The lights went out quickly and then came back on. My heart was beating so fast I felt nauseous, and I had no idea what happened. I ran into the dining room, and my heart sank from fear. All of the chairs were on the floor, scattered and definitely broken. The whistling began. I immediately called my boss and he rushed over. We went to the office and watched the security cameras. The video showed the chairs on top of the tables, the lights go out, come back on, and the chairs were all scattered all over the floor. The look on his face filled my body with dread. He promised to stay with me for the rest of the night, and I told him I was scared of working by myself. This happened a few days ago, and it took everything inside of me, aside from the fact that I'm living paycheck to paycheck, not to quit this job. This was probably the scariest thing I've ever experienced. It was around 2:30 a.m. The baguettes were in the oven, and it was almost time for me to leave. I had to use the restroom, so I walked into the dining room to get to the restroom, and I heard the whistling, but very faintly. It was becoming normal, and since nothing had happened for a while, I wasn't creeped out. I grew up in Flagstaff, Arizona. Many times when you would ask natives about skinwalkers, they would get upset and mostly refuse to even mention the word. My aunt went to a basketball game with the team my uncle was training. She stepped in since he was out sick. The game was on a reservation, and they were on a dirt road heading home around 8 o'clock at night. She said an old woman started floating next to the van, and everyone started to scream. She told everyone in the car to pray, and she said that's when the old woman floated off into the dark. Nobody stopped praying until they got to the meeting line where she dropped off the kids. Another story was from my friend Raiden. He told me that they were at his grandma's house watching TV at night when they heard knocking on the door. He went to go answer it, and his grandparents shouted at him not to, saying that nobody comes out this late except for skinwalkers. He said that after that, they heard knocking on the walls and windows. The windows had boards that you could shut from the inside, so he never saw anything. He said the next day, he heard the walker get on top of their trailer outside and start stomping on it. The next day they came out, and the roof was dented to hell. My friend Anthony told me a story of how he and his brothers were outside with their uncle, and they saw a skinwalker with blood-red eyes and pale white skin, but the face looked like a pig's. They said they sat there frozen, and they saw their uncle also frozen in his spot after making direct eye contact with the walker. The walker started walking towards them, and they said that they grabbed their uncle, dragged him inside, locked everything, and then called the cops. Some pretty terrifying stuff. I wouldn't go searching for any of these things. When I was about 17, I was at my friend's apartment building, which his parents owned. We had an apartment to hang out in on the top floor, and we used to go out to the roof to smoke. That night, we were about to go up, but I had to use the restroom, so I told him I'd meet him there after I was done. I went up the stairs to the attic portion that was connected to the roof. There were no lights, so we always used our phones to guide us. It was an old building, and the attic was creepy and cluttered all the time. As I made my way to the roof, I saw a shadow pass by me. I followed the direction it went, thinking it was my friend. I kept saying that I knew it was him and to stop playing around. The shadow passed me a few more times when I heard my friend's voice from downstairs. He got a call from his girlfriend and was in another room talking to her the whole time. I have no idea what that shadow figure was, and they still refused to go back up to the roof at night after that. My mom grew up near northern Wisconsin. She told me some of her old stories a while back, which happened to her, her brothers, and their area, and some of them I feel are worth mentioning. I've had my own paranormal experiences, which I feel are quite difficult to talk about, and I've talked about a few of them in the past. Maybe I'll share some more. For some backstory on my family, my mom grew up rather poor on a junkyard in the country in northern Wisconsin. For anyone who isn't familiar with Wisconsin, this is the part of Wisconsin that tends to have long stretches of forest and a lot of beautiful nature and scenic views. One of the stories my mom told me was something that happened to a family that apparently lived nearby. There was a family driving through the forest, and eventually, their car broke down. This would have been in the 70s or 80s before cell phones were widespread, so they ended up getting out of their vehicle and making the journey home on foot. Eventually, however, they started to notice sounds from behind them, as if something was following them through the woods, or, perhaps more aptly put, stalking them through the woods. When they ran, it ran. When they stopped, it stopped. Eventually, they were able to get to their house. However, when they quickly entered and slammed the door, locked it, whatever was following them gave them a bellowing scream. Apparently, the family had alerted my grandfather as to what happened, and he told them to look in his fields. According to my mom, he had apparently come back into the house wide-eyed and alarmed, but he didn't elaborate on what he saw. I vaguely recall my mom talking about seeing some sort of glow in the field, though I'm unsure if it's related. But my oldest uncle went horseback riding with a friend, and they apparently came across a thing. Apparently it was white, and when they saw it, it ran off. It stood up on its hind legs, bounced on a fence, and it was gone. Apparently it left behind some fur, which my uncle apparently collected. But this would have been many, many years ago, and my uncle died when I was about 4 years old in a bad accident, so I'm unable to ask him about the story. I'm unsure if both of these stories are related or not, and there could be some natural causes to this. Black bears, wolves, dogs, etc. All could be and would be living in the area. However, judging by the tone of the story and the fact that such animals are rather commonplace, and it was apparently during the day, I'm not sure if it would be mistaken identity or not. What does interest me, though, are the stories of the Wendigo, which I have heard some depictions being somewhat furry from Canada, Skinwalkers, and the Wisconsin's Michigan Dogman. Could maybe be related? I don't know. If it was not a case of mistaken identity, I don't really care to find out either. Just be careful in the woods. Mother Nature can be a cruel mistress, and there is darkness in this world, be it supernatural or the very, very real death of human depravity and cruelty. Protect yourself and your loved ones.